Hey, before this story goes anywhere else, there is one detail from the first account that has never been explained. A man woke up in a hunting cabin in the middle of a West Virginia hollow, and the back wall was knocking. Not the wind, not the pipes, knocking, in a pattern. The back wall of that cabin had been nailed shut from the outside 20 years before he ever rented the key. The rental listing did not mention a back room. He only found the wall because the dog kept sitting in front of it. He made it out before morning. He has never gone back. He still does not know what was on the other side of that wall. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand why he was there in the first place, and how ordinary that first evening looked. Derek was not the kind of person who went looking for anything unusual. He drove a delivery route through rural Pocahontas County, West Virginia, 5 days a week, which meant he knew these roads better than most people know their own neighborhoods. He knew which hollows flooded first in a heavy rain. He knew which gravel roads turned to soup in November and which ones held all year. He knew the smell of a wood stove coming through a truck window at 60 feet, and the particular quality of silence that settles into a mountain hollow about an hour after dark, when even the creek seems to lower its voice. He found the cabin listing through a handwritten index card on a corkboard at a feed store. The kind of listing that does not have a website, does not have reviews, does not have a cancellation policy. Cash up front, key left at a gravel turnout, no questions asked. That suited Derek fine. His job was ending in 6 weeks when the company closed the regional distribution center, and his marriage had been ending for longer than that, in the slow, quiet way that hurts worse than a fight. He needed 2 nights somewhere without a cell signal, without his wife's sister calling to check on things, without the sound of someone moving around in the next room at 2 in the morning, deciding. He drove out on a Friday afternoon in late October. The hollow road was single lane, hemmed in by second-growth timber on both sides, the creek running close enough to the road that in spring it probably crossed it. The cabin sat on a flat cut into the hillside above the creek bank, small, wood-sided, painted once in a color that had become simply gray. 1 porch light, 1 visible window, a stovepipe above the roofline with a fresh cap on it. It looked like exactly what it was, a place people used to go to be left alone. He unloaded his groceries in 2 trips: canned soup, a loaf of bread, a 6-pack, a bag of dog food for Burl, his 7-year-old retriever mix who had ridden the whole way with his head out the passenger window. The inside of the cabin was cleaner than he expected. 2 rooms, a main room with a wood stove, a kitchen table, 2 chairs, and a propane burner on the counter, and a small back bedroom with a cot, a window facing the hollow, and a nail on the wall where someone had hung a calendar so long ago that the pages had gone yellow. The wood stove worked. He got a fire going without trouble, set the soup on the propane burner, and let Burl out to sniff the perimeter while he stood on the porch and tried his phone. No signal. He had expected that. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and listened to the hollow for a minute. The creek, wind moving through the tops of the hemlocks, somewhere up the ridge, something that might have been a barred owl, or might have been the wind doing what wind does in mountain timber. He called Burl in, poured the dog's food into a bowl beside the door, and ate his soup at the kitchen table reading a week-old newspaper he found folded under one of the chairs. That was when he noticed the wall. The main room of the cabin was rectangular, running from the front door to the back. The left side held the kitchen area. The right side held the wood stove and the 2 chairs. But the far left wall, the wall at the back end of the kitchen side, had a seam in it that ran floor to ceiling, about 3 feet wide, with horizontal planks nailed across it every foot or so. It was the shape of a door frame that someone had covered over. Derek looked at it for a moment, then looked back at his newspaper. Old cabins got modified. Pantries got sealed off. Storage rooms got converted, or closed when the shelf unit got heavy enough that nobody wanted to bother moving it. There was nothing unusual about a planked-over doorway in a place like this. Burl did not agree. The dog had eaten his food, done one circuit of the cabin interior, and then positioned himself directly in front of the planked wall. Not barking, not growling, just sitting, the way Burl sat when he was watching something. His head level, his ears slightly forward, his eyes fixed on the planking like he was waiting for something to come through it. Derek told him to knock it off. Burl glanced back at him, then returned his attention to the wall. Derek told him again. The dog came over, circled once, lay down, but not near the stove where it was warm. He lay down facing the wall, 3 feet away from it, facing it. Around 10 o'clock, Derek banked the fire and started thinking about sleep. He was tired from the drive, and the soup and the warmth had done what they do. He was washing the bowl in the small sink when he heard it. 2 taps from the wall. Not loud. About the volume of a knuckle on a hollow door. He held the bowl still and waited. Nothing followed. He set the bowl down carefully and stood in the kitchen, listening. The creak, the stove ticking as the fire settled, the wind. Nothing else. He walked over and pressed his hand flat against the planking. The wood was cold. He knocked once, gently, with his knuckle. No response. He told himself it was the wall flexing from the temperature change. This close to the creek. A hollow like this stayed cold even when the stove was going, and old wood moves when the temperature drops. He had heard houses make stranger sounds than that. He went to the back bedroom. Burl followed him in. He turned off the lamp and listened to the hollow dark for a little while, and then he was asleep. The dog was still awake. He lay at the foot of the cot and faced the direction of the main room all night, and did not sleep once. The next morning was the kind of morning that makes you feel foolish for being spooked the night before. The hollow was bright by 9 o'clock. The October sun, cutting down through the bare upper canopy, at a low angle that turned the creek into something that looked almost silver. Derek drank bad instant coffee on the porch and watched a pair of crows work the tree line on the far bank. Burl chased something into the brush and came back muddy and satisfied. The cabin looked smaller in daylight and more ordinary, just old boards and a tin roof and a stovepipe, sitting on a cut in the hill the way 1,000 other cabins sat on 1,000 other cuts in 1,000 other West Virginia hollows. Derek felt the tension of the previous night go out of him the way tension does when daylight arrives and nothing has happened. He spent the morning walking the property. There was more of it than he expected. The land ran up the ridge behind the cabin and along the hollow floor for several hundred yards in each direction. He found an old fire ring about a quarter mile up the slope. The stones mossy, and the ash in the center turned to black powder, unused for a long time. He found the rusted frame of what might have been a small outbuilding about 100 yards into the timber behind the cabin, collapsed to the point where only the metal remained. The wood had rotted into the ground completely. He found a stretch of the creek where the bank had been reinforced with flat stones laid by hand, a project someone had done carefully and a long time ago for reasons he could not guess at. He did not find any neighbors. The hollow road ran past the cabin and continued up into the timber, but it dead-ended somewhere above him. He could see where it curved up the slope and disappeared into the trees, and he could see no smoke, no structure, nothing that suggested another building. Whoever owned this land, they had not developed it much beyond the cabin itself. He came back at dusk, changed his socks, started the stove again. Heated soup again. He had bought 4 cans, and he worked through them methodically, without much appetite. Burl ate and went directly to his spot facing the planked wall without prompting. Derek looked at the dog, then looked at the wall, then sat down in one of the chairs near the stove with his second beer and tried to read. He could not concentrate. He kept looking at the wall. He kept thinking about the 2 taps. Around 11 o'clock, he turned the propane lamp down and thought about sleeping. He was less tired than the night before and more alert, which he did not like. He was aware of every sound the cabin made, the stove ticking, the screen door trembling faintly when the wind came down the hollow. The creek, always the creek, running just below the level of everything else. Then the knocking started. Same wall. But this time it did not stop after 2 taps. It came in a pattern, 3 pairs, tap tap, pause, tap tap, pause, tap tap, and then silence for about 10 seconds, and then 2 more taps, and then silence again. Burl pressed himself against Derek's leg and trembled. Not a sound from him, just the trembling, and his eyes fixed on the planking, and the pattern continuing. Derek sat very still with his hand on the dog's back and counted the intervals. They were not random. They were not the irregular pop and click of wood in temperature change. There was a rhythm to it that was patient and deliberate, like someone who had been waiting a long time and was not in any particular hurry. He thought about the man who had handed him the key. He had almost forgotten that part. The rental contact had met him at a gravel turnout about 2 miles down the hollow road. A man in his 60s, work coat, cap pulled low, who handed over the key tag without much ceremony and pointed up the road and said the cabin was the only structure up that way, couldn't miss it. He had started to walk back to his truck and then stopped, and without turning around he said, "Don't go in the back if you find it. Owner sealed it for a reason." Derek had thought he meant mold. Old cabins got mold in closed spaces, especially near a creek, and owners sometimes sealed off sections they hadn't remediated properly rather than deal with the remediation cost. He had thought it was a practical warning about air quality. He had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds on the drive up the hollow road, and then forgotten it entirely. He was not thinking about mold now. He picked up his flashlight off the kitchen counter and walked to the planked wall. Burl stayed where he was. The knocking had gone quiet as soon as Derek stood up, and the silence it left behind was worse than the sound. He put his hand on the planking. Cold again. He ran the flashlight beam along the seam and along the horizontal planks, and then he looked at the nails. That was when something shifted in his chest. The planks were nailed from this side of the wall. He was certain of it because the nail heads were facing outward, toward him, which meant whoever had driven those nails had driven them from inside the room, not from the other side. He had assumed the wall had been sealed from the outside, the way you seal off a space you no longer want accessed. But you do not nail a door shut from the inside and then walk out through it. The planks were put there by someone standing exactly where Derek was standing. He took a step back. He ran the flashlight down the left edge of the planked section, and then down the right edge, and then he turned and looked at the room he was standing in. He walked to the exterior wall, the wall that faced the hollow in the creek. He paced the length of it, 14 feet. He walked back to the interior, the kitchen counter, the main room. He paced the interior length of that same wall. He did it twice. He came up with the same number both times. The outside of the cabin was at least 8 feet longer than the inside. There was a room back there. He stood in the kitchen with the flashlight on and listened to the hollow. The creek was running hard from the afternoon rain, and the fog had moved in low enough that from the porch he could not see the tree line. The gravel road would be slick. The hollow road at midnight in fog, with no guardrails, and a drop to the creek on one side, was not a road he wanted to navigate without daylight. He told himself that. He told himself leaving now was the less safe option. He told himself the room was just a room, and the knocking was just the wall, and the nails facing outward meant nothing except that whoever did the job had done it strangely. He took out his phone and photographed the wall, the seam, the nail heads. He angled the flashlight down to the floor and got a shot of the base of the planking where it met the floorboards. In the photos, the planking looked exactly as he had described it to himself. Just a sealed wall, just a covered doorway, just an old renovation done badly. In the lower corner of the last photo, at floor level, right at the gap between the bottom plank and the floor, there was a dark smear. It might have been a shadow. It might have been mud dragged in from the hollow. It might have been something pressed flat against the gap from the other side. He did not sleep again that night. He sat in the chair nearest the front door with his car keys in his hand and the flashlight on the table beside him. Burl came and sat with him, pressed against his shin. The knocking did not return. The wall was silent for the rest of the night, and the silence was somehow worse than the pattern had been, because the pattern, at least, had felt like something with a reason. At 5:30 in the morning, the first gray came into the hollow window. Derek loaded his truck in 2 trips, quiet and fast, without turning on any lights he did not need. He put Burl in the cab. He did not go back inside for a final check. He drove down the hollow road without turning the radio on. At a gas station with a signal, he tried the rental contact's number. Voicemail. He tried it again 2 days later. Voicemail. He never received a call back. The listing disappeared from the feed store corkboard within 2 weeks. He checked, because his route ran past that store. A friend with access to property records looked up the land for him as a favor. The records showed that a man had died on the property in the mid-1990s, a structure fire. The records listed 2 buildings on the land at the time of the fire. Only one had been rebuilt. Derek does not rent informal cabins anymore. When he stays somewhere unfamiliar, he checks every room before he puts his bag down, opens every door, looks in every corner. He has not told many people about the wall because the detail that bothers him most, the nails facing outward, sounds like the kind of thing a frightened person might misremember. He does not think he misremembered it. Burl died 2 years later of old age, which is the natural and ordinary way that good dogs go. In the last few months of his life, he developed a habit in Derek's apartment of going to the far corner of the living room and sitting there, facing the wall, with the same expression he'd worn that first night in the hollow. Head level, ears forward, waiting. Derek would call him away, and the dog would come. But he always went back. The next account is different in almost every way except one. The thing that should not have known something personal did. Maya had done this trail before. That is the first thing she wants you to understand, because it matters. This was not a case of someone inexperienced wandering into backcountry they had no business being in. She had hiked this particular stretch of Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee 4 times over 5 years. Twice in spring, once in summer, once in early fall. She knew where the trail crossed the creek drainage and how slick the rocks got after rain. She knew which section of the ridge exposed you to wind, and which section dropped back into timber and went quiet. She knew the campsite she was heading to, had slept in it before, had hung her food bag from the same bear line anchor on 2 previous trips. She was not lost, she was not unprepared, she was grieving, which is a different kind of disorientation, and one that does not show up on a trail map. Her mother had died 3 months earlier, not suddenly. It had been the long kind, the kind where you have time to prepare, and somehow still aren't ready when it happens. Maya had taken bereavement leave from her job, handled the arrangements, sat in the house for 6 weeks while people brought food, and said the right things, and then found herself in a particular kind of stillness that was not peace. She needed to move. She needed to be somewhere that did not have her mother's handwriting on anything, did not have her mother's coffee mug in the cabinet, did not have her mother's reading glasses folded on the end table next to a library book that would never be finished. She booked the permit, packed her bag, and drove down to Tennessee on a Thursday. The trailhead was quiet when she arrived. A man in a county parks vest was pulling a posted notice off the information board. Not a ranger, just a volunteer, the kind who maintains trail registers and checks condition reports on weekends. He glanced at her pack and nodded, and she nodded back. And she was signing into the trail register when he said, without particular drama, "You going up toward the ridge zone?" She said she was, backcountry Site 3. He nodded again. Then he said, "Don't answer anything that calls from above you on that ridge at night. Sound does funny things up there." She thanked him and thought he was being neighborly about echo effects on exposed ridgelines, which is a real phenomenon. Sound can behave strangely in certain terrain configurations, bouncing off cliff faces and ridge walls in ways that make distant sounds seem close, or close sounds seem to come from somewhere else entirely. She had experienced it before on other trails. She assumed that was what he meant. She shouldered her pack and started up. The hike-in was everything she needed it to be. 6 miles of good trail in late October. The leaves mostly down from the hardwoods, but the hemlocks still full. The sky a cold, clear blue above the ridge. Her boots were broken in, and her pack was weighted correctly. And after the first mile, her body remembered how to do this and stopped thinking about anything else. That is the thing about distance hiking that people who don't do it sometimes fail to understand. It is not meditative in the way sitting still is meditative. It is meditative in the way that anything physical and continuous and demanding becomes meditative, because the body takes up enough of your attention that the other things, the things you drove 4 hours to get away from, have to wait their turn. She made camp before dark. Site 3 was a flat shelf cut into the hillside above the creek drainage, sheltered on 2 sides by a rock outcrop and open to the south with a long view down the valley. She set up her tent facing that view, hung her food bag on the bear line. A cable strung between 2 trees about 40 feet from the tent site, high enough that a bear would have to work for it. Filtered 2 liters of water from the creek below the site. Ate a cold dinner sitting on her sleeping pad outside the tent, watching the valley go dark from the bottom up, the ridgeline holding the last light longest. She wrote a few lines in a small notebook she had brought for that purpose. Not journal entries exactly. She was not someone who journaled. More like notes, fragments. The way the light went. The sound the creek made, which was higher pitched than she expected given how low the water was. The smell of October in a hollow, which is dead leaves and cold mud, and something underneath both of those that has no name. She wrote her mother's name once, and then crossed it out and wrote it again and left it. She turned the headlamp off around 9 and lay in the sleeping bag and listened to the darkness. Wind in the bare upper branches, moving in long, slow pulls. The creek below. Somewhere far off, what might have been an owl. She was tired from the drive and the hike, and she fell asleep faster than she expected. Just after 11, she woke. Not from a sound. She would be specific about this later when she wrote the account. She woke from an absence. The creek was still running. The wind was still moving the branches, but something in the ambient texture of the night had changed in a way she could not name, and her body had registered it before her mind caught up. She lay still and kept her breathing even and listened. A whistle from the ridge above camp. 2 notes, up, then down. Clear, close enough to be on the upper trail, far enough above her that it came from elevation. She waited. Nobody came down the trail. She unzipped the tent door an inch and listened. Wind, creek, nothing else. She told herself another hiker was passing on the upper trail and had kept moving. Two-note whistles were common signals on shared trails, the kind of thing someone might do to let others know they were coming through. She told herself the terrain was making the sound seem closer than it was. She zipped the tent door and went back to sleep. She woke again at 2 in the morning, and this time there was no gradual awareness. She was simply awake, all at once, the way you are when something in the room has changed. The creek was running. The wind was quiet. The tent fabric was still. She lay on her back and looked at the tent ceiling and kept completely still. The headlamp was in her left hand. She had no memory of picking it up. Then, from the ridge above her tent, from a position that was above her, elevated, the upper trail or above it, a voice called her name. Not Maya, the other name. The name her mother had used since she was small, a shortened and particular version of her given name that her mother had created and that no one else used with any regularity. Her college friends knew it and occasionally used it. Her aunt knew it. It was not a secret, but it was specific. The voice was female, soft, unhurried. It had the tone of someone calling for a person they expected to find nearby, not urgent, not frightened, the way you might call across a campsite to someone you thought was getting water. It came from above and to her left, maybe 100 yards of elevation above her tent. She did not answer. She did not move. She did not turn on the headlamp. She lay with her hand around it and her thumb on the switch, and she listened, and she waited, and the voice did not call again. The ridge went quiet. The wind came back after a few minutes, moving through the bare branches above the tent in long, slow pulls, and the creek ran below in the drainage, and nothing else happened for the rest of the night. She would write later that she did not know why she had not answered. She had no rational reason in the moment. The voice had not sounded wrong in any way she could articulate. It had the right gender, the right tone, the right distance. But something about the rhythm of it had been slightly off. The way a voice sounds when it is being performed rather than produced naturally. She had not consciously processed this at the time. She had simply not answered. Later, when she thought about the trail volunteer and what he had said, "Don't answer anything that calls from above you on that ridge at night," she would feel the particular cold that comes from understanding a warning too late to have used it properly, and just early enough to know you were lucky. She stayed in the tent with the headlamp off until the sky began to lighten enough to see the tent ceiling clearly. Then she lay still for another half hour, just to be certain. Then she unzipped the tent door and stepped outside. Her boots were under the vestibule fly where she had left them. She always left them toes out, heels toward the tent, so she could step into them quickly if she needed to leave fast. It was a habit from years of camping. They were facing the other direction. Toes toward the tent door, heels toward the trail, set side by side with the precision of someone who had done it deliberately. She stood in the cold morning in her socked feet and looked at them for a long time. No animal moves boots that way. No wind strong enough to turn a pair of hiking boots 180 degrees without knocking them over had come through that site during the night. She knew what she would have heard if any significant wind had come down off that ridge. She had camped in exposed terrain before, and mountain wind at that elevation in October is not subtle. The night had been still after the early gusts. The boots had been turned. She packed camp in 15 minutes. She did not eat breakfast at the site. She put the boots on and shouldered the pack and started back down the 6 miles to the trailhead, moving at a pace that was faster than comfortable, but not quite a run, because she was also watching the ridgeline above her to the left, where the trail ran parallel to the upper terrain for most of the route back out. She did not look up at the ridge more than she had to. That was a decision she made consciously about a mile into the hike out, when she noticed she had been scanning the upper slope every 30 seconds without meaning to. She made herself stop. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead, and her pace steady and her breathing deliberate, and she covered the 6 miles in just under 2 hours, which was fast for her on that terrain. About 2 miles from the trailhead, she came around a switchback and nearly walked into a couple coming the other way. Late 30s, both of them, with the kind of gear that said experienced rather than recreational. They stepped to the side of the trail, and she stepped to the other side, and they exchanged the brief nod that hikers exchange when passing, and she almost kept going. She stopped. She did not plan to say anything, but she stopped and turned back and said, as plainly as she could manage, "I want to tell you something before you go up there." They listened. She kept it simple, the voice from the ridge, the name it used, the boots when she came out in the morning. She left out the part about her mother because it felt too private to hand to strangers on a trail, and also because she was not entirely sure yet what it meant, and did not want to start thinking about it on the side of a mountain with 6 miles behind her, and the ridge still visible above. The woman had gone pale before Maya finished. Not the pale of skepticism or polite discomfort, the pale of recognition. She said her sister had hiked this trail alone 3 years ago. Same zone, same campsite area. Her sister had woken in the night to a female voice calling her name from the ridge above the camp, and had packed out before dawn without sleeping again, and had never gone back. The sister had not used the trail volunteers phrase exactly, but she had said the same thing Maya now understood, that the voice was close enough, but the rhythm was wrong. That it was almost right. Almost. The couple turned around. Maya watched them go back down the trail ahead of her and felt something she could not quite name. Not relief, because knowing someone else had experienced the same thing did not make the thing itself less real. Something closer to the feeling of finding a word for something that had only been a sensation. It had happened before. It happened to other people. Whatever it was, it had a pattern. She reached the trailhead at 9:30 in the morning. The volunteer was not there. The information board had a new notice on it, a trail condition update for a different section of the forest. She signed out of the trail register and looked at the column of names before hers, and did not recognize any of them. And then she drove back north with the heat on and the radio off. She posted the account that evening on a hiking forum she'd used for years, under the username she always used. She included the detail about the name, the boots, and the couple she had met on the trail. She did not include her mother. Within 24 hours, the post had several responses. 3 of them, from accounts that appeared to be regular users of the forum, referenced the same area of Cherokee National Forest. 2 of them mentioned female voices. 1 mentioned a name being called. None of them mentioned the same name because the name was always different. Always the right name for the person hearing it. Always a version that was specific and personal rather than generic. No official Cherokee National Forest documentation she could find mentioned any unusual incidents in that zone. She called the district office and described the trail volunteer. Older man, county parks vest, working the information board on a Thursday morning in late October. They had no record of a volunteer matching that description scheduled for that date. The name she offered, which she had seen on his vest, did not match any volunteer on their current list. She put the phone down and sat with that for a while. When she opened her camera roll to look at the photos from the trip, she found one she did not remember taking. It was between 2 photos she did remember. One of the valley view from the campsite at dusk, one of the creek at the water filter spot. The photo she did not remember was of the tent interior. Just the ceiling of the tent and the headlamp cord hanging from the center hook, slightly blurred, the way photos look when they are taken in low light without intention. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m., 18 minutes after she had heard the voice. She did not remember waking at that time. She did not remember picking up the phone. She had been lying still with the headlamp in her left hand and her thumb on the switch, and the phone had been in her jacket pocket, which was folded at the foot of her sleeping bag. The photo was completely ordinary: ceiling fabric, headlamp cord, darkness. There was nothing in it that should have caused her hands to shake when she looked at it. The hands shook anyway. She showed the photo to one person, a friend who had done backcountry hiking with her before, and who she trusted to take it seriously. The friend looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then handed the phone back and said, "Delete it." Maya asked why. The friend said, "Because if you keep looking at it, you're going to find something in it, and I don't think you should." Maya kept it. She's not looked at it often. She does not know what she would find if she looked long enough. The forum post was deleted about 2 weeks after she put it up. She does not know if she deleted it herself, she does not remember doing it, or if the forum's moderation removed it for some reason. A screenshot of it circulated in a few places afterward. Several of the accounts that had responded to the original post were no longer active when she went back to check. She still hikes. She has covered several hundred miles of trail since that October, in other states, other forests, other terrain. She has not gone back to Cherokee National Forest. She has not returned to that zone. She does not think of herself as someone who is frightened of the woods, because the woods were not what frightened her. What frightened her was the specificity, that the voice knew which name to use. Not her public name, but the one that belonged to a smaller and more private version of her, the one only a few people knew. She does not answer when someone calls her by that name unless she can see their face. She is not always sure she can explain why. She thinks about the rhythm being wrong. She thinks about how close the voice was to right, and what the distance between almost right and completely right actually means, and whether that distance is the thing that saved her, or just the thing she noticed. The notebook she brought on the trip is still in her pack's hip belt pocket. She does not use it anymore. When she got home and looked at it, the entries from the trip read normally: observations about the light, the creek sound, the smell of the hollow. Her mother's name, crossed out and written again. The kind of notes she had described. The last line at the bottom of the final entry was the word quiet. Written 6 times in a row, each instance slightly smaller than the one before it, until the last one was so small she had to hold the notebook under a lamp to be sure of what it said. She does not remember writing it. She has not written in that notebook since. She has not thrown it away either, which she cannot fully explain. Some part of her feels that throwing it away would be a kind of decision she is not ready to make, though she could not say exactly what that decision would be. Sometimes it is not a sound or a voice. Sometimes it is the road itself. Calvin had driven the back road between his brother's place and his own house more times than he could count, which is the kind of thing that sounds like an exaggeration until you do the math. 11 years on a rural mail route in Letcher County, Kentucky, and before that another 10 years in the county doing various work that required a truck and a willingness to drive narrow roads without complaint. He knew the back roads of that part of eastern Kentucky the way people who have worked them for decades know them. Not just the curves and the grades, but the texture of them. The way a particular stretch of gravel sounded different, wet than dry. The way certain hollows held fog differently than others. The way specific curves felt in the steering wheel before the headlights confirmed what was coming. He knew this road. He topped off his gas tank at a closed station a few miles from his brother's place. The kind of station that stopped selling lottery tickets and hot food years ago but kept one pump running on card, because enough people still needed it. It was a Sunday in early November. Full dark by 6:30. which in that part of Kentucky in that season came fast and complete, the overcast pulling what was left of the light down early. He turned onto the county road and settled in. Radio low. One arm on the window frame. Watching the right shoulder for deer, because this stretch of road in November was prime crossing territory, and he had already replaced one bumper that year. The road climbed over a ridge and dropped down the other side into the next hollow, and that was where the shortcut saved its time. The ridge section was the part that required attention. 2 sharp curves on the downhill side, no guardrails, a drop to the creek on the right shoulder that was steep enough to be serious. He had driven it in worse conditions than this. He drove it now the way he always drove it, taking the curves wide and keeping his speed down and watching the headlight reach on each bend before committing to it. Coming down the first sharp curve, his headlights caught a green mile marker post on the right shoulder. He noticed it the way you notice something that is not wrong enough to stop for, but wrong enough to register. A small pause in his thinking. He slowed slightly, passed it, checked the mirror. The post was there. Green, standard county issue, a white number stenciled on it. He drove on. He told himself the county road department had put it up recently. They added posts on rural roads for emergency response purposes, so dispatchers could direct ambulances and fire trucks to specific locations on roads that had no other landmarks. He had probably just missed it before, driving this stretch mostly in daylight or with his attention on the curves. By the time he reached the flat creek section at the bottom, he had mostly stopped thinking about it. Then his headlights hit the same post. Same green, same height, same white number stenciled on the face. On the right shoulder of a bend, he had driven a conservative estimate of 300 times. He stopped the truck. He sat for a moment with the engine running and the headlights on the post and tried to work out whether this could be a different post with the same number. That was not how mile markers worked. The numbers were sequential and never repeated on the same road, because the entire point of them was to give a unique location identifier. He got out of the truck and walked to the post and put his hand on it. Metal. Cold, solid in the ground. He rapped it with his knuckle and it rang dully the way a hollow metal post rings. He looked at the number. He drove back up the ridge. The first post was gone. He sat in the truck at the top of the ridge for 4 minutes. He knew it was 4 minutes because he looked at his phone when he stopped and looked at it again when he put the truck in gear. He did not know what he had been waiting for in those 4 minutes. He drove home on the long route, which added 25 minutes and took him through a small town he rarely used, past a dollar store and a closed diner and a church with a lighted sign out front. He did not turn the radio on for the whole drive. He did not tell anyone about the post that night or the next day or for several weeks after. He avoided the road for the rest of November. His brother noticed because they saw each other most weekends, and the back road was the obvious route. Calvin said the ridge section got slick after the first frost, and he'd rather add the time. His brother accepted this without comment. His brother had lived in Letcher County his whole life and understood that some roads were better avoided for reasons that did not require elaboration. In December, his brother called on a Tuesday evening. He had heard something from a county deputy he knew, the kind of information that moves through small communities along informal channels before it ever reaches a newspaper. A man had been found on the back road, the ridge section, at the bottom curve. Middle-aged, out-of-state plates. He had been sitting in his car for 2 days before anyone found him. He was disoriented but physically unharmed. He told the deputy he had been driving the curve but that the drive had seemed to take about 20 minutes. He could not account for the 2 days. He did not know how he had gotten there or why he had stopped. The car had been found facing uphill. The man said he had been going downhill when he stopped. The road at that section was single lane with no shoulder wide enough to turn a car around in. Nobody could explain the direction. Calvin did not say anything to his brother about the post. He thanked him for the information and hung up and sat in his kitchen for a while with the phone on the table in front of him. He drove the road in the daylight the following Saturday. He went slowly on the ridge section and stopped at both curves. There was no mile marker post at either location. There was no hole in the gravel shoulder where a post would have been set. Setting a metal post into a road shoulder leaves a mark. Disturbed gravel, a ring of compacted earth. There was nothing. He drove to the Flat Creek section and checked both shoulders along the bend where the second post had appeared. Nothing. He called the county road department on Monday and described what he was looking for and asked whether any new posts had been installed on that road in the past year. The man he spoke to checked and said no new markers had been installed on that road in over a decade. The department had discussed it as part of an emergency response improvement project, but the budget hadn't come through. There was a bait shop near the creek crossing at the bottom of the hollow, about a quarter mile from the bend. Calvin had stopped there occasionally over the years for nothing in particular. A soda, a container of worms when he still fished, sometimes just to stretch his legs on a long drive. The man who ran it was old in the way that certain men who work outdoors their whole lives become old, weathered and slow-moving, but alert in a way that younger men often weren't. Calvin stopped in on a Wednesday, bought a soda he didn't particularly want, and mentioned that he'd been having some trouble understanding the road signs on the county road over the ridge. The old man did not ask him to be more specific. He looked at Calvin for a moment and then looked at the window that faced the creek and said, "That bend has always been a bad one. There's a reason the county won't put guardrails on it." He paused. "Some places, you put up a sign, it's like an invitation." Calvin asked what he meant by that. The man shrugged and went back to arranging something behind the counter. He did not say anything else about it. Calvin finished his soda and left. He thought about the phrase afterward. An invitation. He had turned it over for a while without being able to decide what it meant exactly, or whether the old man had meant it the way it sounded, or, in some more practical sense, he wasn't following. He had lived in rural Kentucky his whole life, and he understood that certain things were communicated sideways in small communities, through implication and omission, because saying them directly felt like giving them more reality than they deserved, or more attention than was safe. He thought the old man knew something about that bend. He thought the old man had said approximately as much about it as he intended to say. He learned more about the man who had been found in the car through the deputy connection his brother had. The man had been driving alone. He was from Ohio, passing through on his way to visit family further south, and he had taken the county road off the main highway because his GPS had suggested it as a shorter route. He remembered the curve at the top of the ridge. He remembered beginning to descend. He did not remember anything after that until the deputy knocked on his window. His phone showed no calls made or received during the 2 days. The battery had not drained significantly, which suggested the phone had not been in use. The car's gas tank was nearly full when he was found, even though the nearest station was 20 miles away, and he had presumably been there for 2 days with the engine off. The man never publicly explained the experience. Calvin tried once, through the deputy, to get a message to him. Not to compare notes exactly, but because he felt the man deserved to know that someone else had had something strange happen on that road and survived it without apparent harm. The message was not returned. Calvin went through his phone photos the following week. He had taken one photo when he stopped at the second post. A quick shot, the kind you take when you want a record of something without being entirely sure why. He had not looked at it since that night. He opened it now at his kitchen table. The post was clearly visible. The bend in the road was clearly visible. The headlights lit the right shoulder in a flat wash of white. In the background, above the post, on the high shoulder where the slope rose steeply into timber before the guardrail-less drop, there was a shape. Pale, vertical, approximately the height and proportion of a person standing still. Too far from the camera and too dark behind the headlight wash to be certain of anything. The trees at that point on the road were hemlock. He knew this because he had driven the road hundreds of times, and the hemlocks on that shoulder were distinctive, tall and narrow. The shape was not a hemlock. The shape had no branches. It was standing in the space between two hemlocks and it was not moving. Or, if it was moving, the photo had not captured the movement. He showed it to two people. The first said it was a fence post. There is no fence on that section of the road. The second person looked at the photo for about 15 seconds, and then handed the phone back without saying anything. Calvin waited. The person did not offer an opinion. They changed the subject. The photo is still on his phone. He does not show it often. He does not know what the shape was. A trick of light. A tree he was misremembering. Something on the road he had not noticed in the moment. Something else entirely. He does not know what the mile marker was or who put it there or what purpose it served. He does not know what happened to the man from Ohio on that bend or what the 2 days contained that the man could not access. He knows one thing with certainty, which is that the post was there and then it was not, and that no post had been installed or removed on that road according to any official record. Everything else is interpretation. In the spring, the old man at the bait shop died. It was not unexpected. He had been in poor health for some time, and the shop had been running on reduced hours for months. Calvin went to the small service they held at a church in town. He did not know the family well, but he had been a customer for years, and it felt right to go. At the reception afterward, he overheard one of the man's daughters talking to someone, a neighbor, it sounded like, about her father. She was talking about his habits, his expressions, the particular things he always said. At some point, she said, "He always called that bend on the county road the confused road since I was little. We never knew what he meant by it." The neighbor nodded. Other people nearby nodded. The daughter moved on to something else. Nobody asked what the phrase meant. Nobody seemed to find it strange enough to ask. Calvin drove home on the long route. He has continued to drive it on the long route every time since. The next account comes from a woman who spent 22 years in the Park Service. She does not scare easily. That is what makes this worth paying attention to. Ranger Denise had learned early in her career that the most dangerous thing a person could bring into a park was certainty. Certainty about the weather. Certainty about the trail condition. Certainty about their own experience level relative to the terrain. She had seen what certainty did to people who encountered something that fell outside what they were certain of, and it was never useful. So she had made a practice, over 22 years, of holding her assessments loosely, of building in what she privately called the gap, the space between what she expected to find and what she might actually find. It had made her a better ranger and a more careful one, and it had served her well in almost every situation she had encountered on the job. The fire tower did not care about the gap. She had worked solo monitoring shifts before. It was standard practice during drought alert periods, when the service needed eyes on the ridges around the clock, and there were never quite enough personnel to do it comfortably. The tower sat at roughly 4,000 feet on a ridge above the Blue Ridge Parkway's adjacent land, accessed by a service road that she chained at the bottom when she arrived, because the tower was not open to the public and the road was not on any tourist map. 3 directions gave her good sight lines over the canopy, The fourth direction, northeast, looked into a deep drainage that was restricted access. Not because of fire risk specifically, but because of old mine collapse risk from the Crandall operation that had worked that drainage decades before. The drainage was visually cut off from the tower by an intermediate ridgeline. She could not see into it. She could only see the ridgeline that hid it. She ran her standard morning check in late August, during a stretch of weather that had produced no rain in 3 weeks, and a fire risk index that the district was watching closely. Weather instruments, radio test, log entry, check-in with the district office at 8. She brewed coffee on the small propane unit in the tower cab and settled into the rhythm of a monitoring shift, which was mostly a matter of patience. Scan the canopy, log the conditions, wait, scan again. The landline to the district worked intermittently, which was normal. The radio worked on the repeater shared with 3 other towers. The view was extraordinary in a way that did not become ordinary even after hours of looking at it, which was one of the things she had always appreciated about tower duty. Around 2 in the afternoon, her radio produced a short burst of static on Channel 4. She looked at the radio. Channel 4 had been decommissioned 18 months earlier when the district switched to a new equipment system. The new system used different frequencies and the old channels had been retired in sequence. Channel 4 was not in use by any district unit she was aware of. She checked her channel log. Channel 4, decommissioned, date noted, no active units. She wrote it in the day's log as equipment noise, possible bleed from legacy equipment in a neighboring county, or from a private landowner still running old gear. It happened occasionally. Old frequencies did not disappear cleanly. Sometimes they produced residual signals for months or years after the equipment broadcasting on them was retired, particularly in mountain terrain where the radio environment was already complicated by topography. She did not think about it again until 11 o'clock that night. She had been on the cot in the tower cab for about an hour, not quite sleeping. Tower shifts rarely produced real sleep, just a kind of half-rest with one ear still on the radio, when Channel 4 produced a voice. Not static, not the broken syllables of a distant signal degrading through terrain. A voice, clear enough to understand, with the particular quality of someone speaking deliberately into a radio handset rather than speaking in a room. She was sitting up before the transmission finished, a grid reference. Then, Trail 9, Sector 4, person down, need extraction. She was at the radio before she had consciously decided to move. She checked her map, the district map she had folded and unfolded so many times the crease lines had gone soft. Trail 9, Sector 4. She found the grid reference on the map and put her finger on it and held the flashlight close. The coordinates fell inside the northeast drainage, the restricted zone, the old Crandall mine area. There was no Trail 9 on any map she had. There had never been a Trail 9 in that section. The drainage had been restricted from foot traffic for years, had never been developed for recreational use, and the mine collapse risk had kept it off any route planning the district had ever done. She radioed the district office on her active channel. The duty officer answered on the second call, which was good for that hour. She described the transmission, the channel, the grid reference, the message. She kept her voice level because she had trained herself to keep her voice level, because panic on a radio channel was contagious, and she had seen what it did to a search operation. The duty officer was quiet for a moment, and then said, Channel 4 was confirmed dark, no active units on that frequency, and that she should log it as equipment error and get some rest. She logged it. She wrote down every word of the transmission first, from memory, and then she wrote the duty officer's response, and then she wrote equipment error as instructed. She put the date and time at the top of the entry in the careful block, printing she had used in logbooks for 22 years. Then she wrote the grid reference on a separate piece of paper and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She did not sleep well on the cot. The tower cab was quiet except for the wind on the windows and the occasional pop of the radio scanning through its active channels, and the landline making its faint electrical hum from the wall. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the transmission in the methodical way she thought about things that required explanation. Equipment error was possible. Legacy frequencies could produce garbled transmissions that sounded like coherent speech. Radio pareidolia, one of the engineers at the district had called it once, the same cognitive mechanism that makes you hear your name in crowd noise. But she had heard the transmission clearly. The grid reference had been specific. The message had been structured exactly as a distress call was supposed to be structured, in the format that Park Service personnel used, not the format a civilian with a radio would use. In the morning, she watched the northeast drainage through binoculars during her scan cycles. The intermediate ridgeline cut off her view of the drainage floor, but she could see the upper slopes and the rim of the drainage where it broke into the open above the tree line. Nothing moved, no smoke, no flash of color that would indicate a person on the slope. The drainage looked exactly as it always looked, heavily timbered on the lower slopes, rocky and exposed on the upper, the ridgeline cutting it off from the view of anyone not positioned directly above it. She completed her shift and drove back to the district office. Before she changed out of her uniform, she went to the records room and pulled the historical logbooks for the period covering the mid-90s through the early 2000s. She knew roughly what she was looking for because the duty officer's response, "Log it and move on," had the particular quality of a response given by someone who had given it before. It took her 2 hours to find the first instance. 1994. A solo monitoring shift at the same tower, different ranger. Channel 4 transmission at night, grid reference noted. Message not fully intelligible. Logged as equipment error. She found a second in 1997, a third in 1998. By the time she had worked through the available logs, she'd found 7 instances of unexplained Channel 4 transmissions during late-night monitoring shifts at that tower, spread across a 9-year period, each one logged and filed and apparently never followed up on. The grid references in each entry were not identical. They were close, clustered in the same section of the northeast drainage, but with small variations that might have indicated different positions within the same general area. Except for the last one in the series, from 2001. She put her note from her jacket pocket on the table beside the logbook and compared the grid references digit by digit. They were identical. The transmission she had received the previous night had given the same grid reference as a transmission logged in 2001 to the digit. Not approximately the same. Not from the same general area, the same location precisely, in a drainage that had no Trail 9, had never had a Trail 9, and had been restricted access since before the first transmission in the record. She sat with that for a long time. The following week, a trail volunteer working the boundary of the restricted area, clearing blowdown from a wind event that had come through in July, found a radio partially buried in the leaf litter near the drainage edge. He brought it to the district office in a plastic bag, the way volunteers brought found objects. Denise happened to be at the office when he came in. She looked at the radio through the bag without touching it. It was an older model. She recognized it because she had used that model herself in her first years with the service, before the district updated its equipment. It was the model that had been standard issue before the channel switch 18 months ago, the model that would have broadcast on Channel 4 before the decommissioning. It was partially compressed by what looked like soil pressure, as if it had been in the ground long enough for the earth to settle around it. There was no battery in the battery compartment. The contacts were corroded in a way that suggested long-term exposure rather than recent damage. An older ranger at the office, a man who had worked the district for 30 years and was within a year of retirement, looked at the radio in the bag and then at Denise and said, "That drainage puts out radio noise sometimes, since the collapse. We used to get calls from it in the 90s. He paused. He looked at the radio again. "We logged them and moved on." Another pause, longer. "Don't hike down into it trying to find something. Nobody has ever found anything. That's the point." She asked him what he meant by the point. He looked at her in the way that people who have worked a place for a long time sometimes look at people who have worked it for less time. Not unkindly, but with the patience of someone who has stopped expecting certain questions to have answers that would satisfy the person asking. He said, "The point is that it keeps calling, and nobody has ever found anything. Those are two facts. Make of them what you want." The radio was logged as equipment debris and sent to storage. 3 months later, when Denise requested it as part of her own informal documentation of the transmission history, she was told it had been misplaced in the transfer between storage locations during a facility reorganization. The log entry confirming its discovery and receipt still existed in the records. The radio did not. She filed the information away with the copy she had made of the historical log entries and the note with the grid reference from her own shift. She completed her season. She did not request another fire tower assignment. She transferred to a different district the following spring, which was something she had been considering for other reasons, and which became easier to decide after the shift. She tells the account carefully when she tells it, which is not often. She notes every practical element: the decommissioned channel, the district confirmation, the historical log entries, the recovered radio, the identical grid reference. She does not characterize what any of it means. She does not say the drainage is haunted. She does not use that word or any word like it. She says there is a transmission history from a restricted area that no official investigation has ever sourced, and that the same location has been named in those transmissions across a span of years that exceeds the operational life of any single piece of equipment. She says she was not willing to go down into that drainage to find out what was there, and that she considers that one of the better professional decisions she made in 22 years. She still carries a radio when she works. She has never put it on Channel 4 again, even though the frequency is technically open now after the second equipment switch. She is not sure she could fully explain why. It is not quite fear. It is something more like the professional instinct that kept her alive and effective for 2 decades, the one that tells you when the gap between what you expect and what you might find is wider than it is safe to cross. The trail volunteer who found the radio asked her once, sometime after she had transferred, whether she thought there was still someone down there, in the drainage. She said she did not know. He nodded. He said, "The ground up there doesn't sound empty when you walk on it." She did not ask him to explain what he meant by that. She did not need to. Some of these places have been wrong for a long time. Long enough that the people who grew up near them built rules around them. The next account is about a man who inherited those rules and misread one of them. Ray had been hunting that ridge since he was 12 years old. His father had taken him up on a cold November morning with a borrowed rifle that was too big for him and shown him where to sit and told him to be still. And he had been still. And at first light, a 6-point buck had walked across the bench below the stand, and his father had whispered now, and he had shot and missed and cried a little from embarrassment, and his father had said nothing except that they would try again tomorrow. They tried again the next morning, and he did not miss. He had hunted that land every season since, which put him at close to 50 years of knowledge of that ridge, the stands, the game trails, the creek crossings, the places where the timber opened up, and the places where it closed in so tight that even a deer moved carefully. He had never much liked the east-facing hollow. He could not have told you exactly why if you had asked him in the years before it became a question worth answering. It was a preference, the way hunters develop preferences for terrain, a particular stand that produced consistently, a particular creek crossing that always showed sign, a particular hollow that felt wrong in a way you learned to trust even when you couldn't name it. He hunted the west face and the ridge line. He left the east hollow alone. The hollow had a name in the family's informal geography, the quiet one, which he had always taken as descriptive. Hollows in McDowell County were either loud or quiet, depending on how the terrain moved air and sound, and the East Hollow was simply a quiet one, the kind where even in wind the sound seemed muffled, contained. On a morning in early November, 6 years before he stopped hunting the land entirely, Ray walked up to his stand on the ridge in the dark and settled in before a first light with his thermos of coffee and his hand warmers and his paper call, and his grunt tube hung on the stand arm. The coffee was bad in the way that coffee made at 4 in the morning before a hunt is always bad, too strong and too hot, and tasting faintly of the thermos. He drank it anyway. He watched the gray come into the ridge and the bench below take shape out of the dark, and he listened to the hollow wake up the way a hunter listens, with his whole body and without anticipating. The birds came in at dawn the way they always did. First the crows working the ridge above him, then the smaller birds in the timber, the nuthatches and the chickadees and the juncos that moved through the brush in loose flocks at first light. The sound of a ridge at dawn is specific and layered, and Ray knew it the way he knew his own name. It rose the way it always rose, and then it stopped. All of it, at once, as if someone had put a hand over the sound and held it. Ray had hunted long enough to know what sudden silence meant. A predator moving through, close enough that the birds had all registered it at the same moment and gone still together. It happened with coyotes sometimes, and occasionally with a bobcat working the lower brush, and rarely with a bear moving through the timber below the ridge. The birds knew before he did, always. That was one of the things hunting had taught him, that the animals around you were a better instrument than anything you could carry. He went still and watched the bench below his stand. Nothing moved. He watched the slope to his left, the east face dropping toward the hollow. Nothing visible. He watched the timber above him on the ridge. Nothing. He held his grunt tube and did not use it, and waited for whatever had silenced the ridge to show itself or move on. It did not move on. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The birds stayed silent. In Ray's experience, a predator moved through in 5 minutes or less. Even a bear, working slowly, would clear an area in that time and the birds would resume. 30 minutes of silence meant something he did not have a category for. He sat with that and waited, and the silence continued, and somewhere around the 40-minute mark he became aware of something else. A sound from the hollow below him. Faint enough that he could not be certain at first he was hearing it and not imagining it, which was the kind of uncertainty that a man alone in the woods at dawn has to take seriously in both directions. He strained forward in the stand slightly, which he knew better than to do from a hunting perspective, and listened. It was rhythmic, low. Not the creek. He knew the creek's sound, and this was separate from it, beneath it in pitch if not in position. Not an animal sound he could name. Not wind in the hollow, because the hollow by its shape and depth produced its own particular sound in wind, and this was not that. It was patterned in a way that felt intentional without being regular. The intervals between repetitions were not consistent, but the repetitions themselves were consistent in quality, the same sound each time. He listened to it for several minutes and could not identify it. Then the birds came back. all at once, the same way they had stopped. The ridge went from total silence to full morning sound in a single moment, and whatever he had been hearing from the hollow was gone beneath the bird noise. He could not hear it anymore. He was not certain, in the immediate aftermath of the birds returning, whether he had heard anything at all. He climbed down from the stand that morning without seeing a deer. He walked back to his truck without checking the hollow edge, without walking the east face, without investigating the sound. He drove home. His wife asked how it went, and he said quiet, which was accurate. He did not tell her about the silence or the sound. He did not go back for a week, which was unusual for him during the season, and when his wife asked about that, he said his knee was bothering him. The knee was fine. He told his nephew it was the kind of quiet that makes a man feel watched from below. That was the most specific he was willing to be for some time. A week later, he went back with Scratch. Scratch was a beagle mix, 8 years old, with a nose that had been reliable for most of her working life, and a temperament that Ray described as sensible, which was the highest compliment he gave to dogs or people. She did not spook easily. She worked brush without complaint, and came back when she was called and had the kind of sustained focus on a track that made her useful in heavy cover. He brought her because he wanted company on the ridge, and because she would tell him, with her behavior, whether the hollow was worth worrying about. Dogs were better instruments than anything you could carry. He planned to work the west slope and the ridge line and keep well clear of the east hollow. Scratch went into the brush on the west slope within minutes of arriving, and Ray worked the ridge, listening to her bell collar and following her movement by sound the way you do when a dog is working cover you can't see into. She was doing what she was supposed to do. Everything was ordinary. Then her bell went quiet. Not gradually, it simply stopped. He waited for it to resume, the way a dog's bell resumes when she pauses on a track and then commits to it. It did not resume. He called her name. Nothing. He called again, louder, in the direction he had last heard the bell. Silence from the west slope. He moved along the ridge toward the east face, calling, and began to understand from the direction his own calls were going that she had crossed the ridge line and come down the east face, toward the hollow. He reached the hollow edge where the slope steepened and the rhododendron thicket began. The rhododendron on the east face was old growth, the kind that interlocked above head height and created a tunnel system in the ground layer that a dog could work through and a man could not. He could see the upper canopy of the hollow below him through the rhododendron branches, and beyond that faintly the creek. He could not see the hollow floor. He called Scratch for 20 minutes from the edge. His voice went down into the hollow and came back changed by the terrain, the way voices change in enclosed spaces. No response from the dog. Then he heard it again. The sound. The same rhythmic, low, patterned thing he had heard from the stand the week before. Closer this time, not from the hollow bottom, but from the slope below him, somewhere inside the rhododendron thicket, somewhere between the hollow edge where he stood and the creek he could not see. Then Scratch whimpered. Once. A short, small sound, the kind of sound she made when she was uncertain or uncomfortable. It came from the hollow floor, below and to his left, inside the thicket. Then nothing. He stood at the hollow edge and thought about his grandfather's rule, which his father had passed along to him in the casual way that practical rules get passed along in families. Not as a formal instruction, but as a given, something understood. The family rule about the East Hollow was simple. Don't go into the hollow floor. His father had said it the same way he said, don't climb that fence or don't cross the creek in spring flood. Practical, without drama. The kind of rule that implied someone had learned it the hard way and saved others the same lesson. Ray had always interpreted it as a flood warning, The hollow floor in a wet spring could fill fast, the creek overrunning its banks, and the rhododendron holding the water in a way that made the floor dangerous for hours after a rain. He had accepted that interpretation without question because it made sense. He called Scratch for another hour from the edge. He did not go in. He was alone. His truck was a mile back. There was no cell signal, and the rhododendron was thick enough that a man with a rifle and a pack would have serious trouble moving through it without a clear path. Those were practical reasons for not going in. They were also true. He did not examine whether there was a third reason. At dusk, Scratch came out of the hollow. She emerged from the rhododendron about 50 yards north of where he had heard her whimper, moving through the thicket at the edge and stepping up onto the slope without any particular urgency. She was not muddy. She was not panting. She showed no sign of injury or distress and no sign of having worked hard cover for several hours. No burrs in her coat, no cuts on her paws, no elevated breathing. She walked to Ray and pressed against his leg and stayed there, and she did not look back at the hollow. He checked the ground where she had emerged. The soil at the hollow edge was soft from recent rain, the kind of soft that takes a print cleanly. Scratch weighed about 25 pounds and had small, distinct paws. There were no prints in the soil where she had stepped out. He looked at the ground carefully, moving a few feet in each direction, checking the edge of the rhododendron line where the soil was exposed. No prints. He put his own boot into the soil beside the spot and lifted it, and the print was clear and complete. The soil would have taken Scratch's prints. It had not taken them. He looked at the hollow edge for a while. Then he looked at the ground more carefully, working the edge in both directions, and found one thing. A piece of torn fabric about the size of his palm, orange, the blaze orange that hunters used for vests and caps. It was partially worked into the soil, not lying on top of it but embedded in the upper layer, the way something gets embedded when it has been pressed into the ground repeatedly over a long period of time. It was not from his vest, which was intact. It was not new. He could not have said how long it had been there, but it had been there long enough to become part of the ground rather than something resting on it. He put it in his jacket pocket and walked back to his truck with Scratch pressed against his leg the entire way. She did not look back at the hollow once. He showed the fabric to his nephew the following weekend, and neither of them could place it. His nephew, who had an interest in the family land's history, went through the old hunting records his father had kept, a series of small notebooks going back to the 70s, logging dates and weather and deer taken and any notable events on the property. He found an entry from 1978. A cousin, hunting the east face, had fallen from a stand. He had been found at the hollow edge, not seriously injured, and had not returned to hunt that land afterward. The entry noted he had been wearing a blaze orange vest. Ray held the piece of fabric for a moment and then put it in the wood stove. He did not explain why. His nephew did not ask. He hunted the ridge 2 more times that season. Both times the birds went silent above the hollow. Both times Scratch refused to work east of the ridge line. Not dramatically, not with any display, just a consistent refusal to cross an invisible line on the slope. The way a well-trained dog sometimes refuses a command that conflicts with something it understands better than you do. He did not push her past it. In 2011, he stopped hunting the family land. He told people it was his knees. His knees were functional. He had walked every inch of that ridge for 50 years, and his knees would have carried him for more. His nephew, who knew him well enough to know the difference, did not press it. He accepted the explanation and noted that Ray had stopped talking about the East Hollow entirely, the way a person stops talking about a room in a house they have decided never to open again. The land is still in the family. Nobody hunts the east face. The hollow is still there. the rhododendron still thick on the slope, the creek still running at the bottom. Ray's nephew drove out once after hearing the full account and parked at the ridgeline above the hollow and sat with the engine off for a while, looking down into the canopy below. He said it looked like every other hollow in McDowell County. Same timber, same terrain, same quality of mountain silence. He said that was almost the worst part, that it looked completely ordinary, that there was nothing visible from the ridge that would tell you anything was different about it. He said it also looked like a place that was aware of being watched, which he acknowledged was not a rational thing to say, and said it anyway. The sixth account is quieter than the ones before it. The horror is mostly architectural. T found the cabin listing on a vacation rental site, the way people find things on vacation rental sites, by filtering for remote, by filtering for no reviews, because no reviews sometimes meant recently listed and therefore available on short notice, and by looking at the photos long enough to decide whether the place matched the particular quality of silence she was looking for. She was a writer. She needed 4 days without interruption, without the specific interruption of her regular life in a city that was loud in the way. Cities are loud even when you have learned to stop hearing it. She needed the kind of quiet that required distance to achieve, the kind you could not approximate with noise-canceling headphones and a closed door. The listing showed a kitchen, a living room, a main bedroom, and a second room described as a workspace with a writing desk and a window facing the woods. 2 bedrooms total, according to the listing. The photos showed the exterior, wood-sided cabin on a wooded lot in Ashe County, North Carolina. Western high country, creek visible below the lot line, the kitchen, the living room, the workspace. The photos did not show the hallway. T noticed this later. At the time of booking, she did not notice it because you do not look for what is not shown. She arrived at dusk on a Wednesday. The gravel road off the secondary state road was about a quarter mile, bordered by timber on both sides, ending at a small parking area in front of the cabin. She brought in her groceries and her bag and her laptop, and found the cabin clean, well heated from a baseboard unit, and stocked with the basics: coffee, dish soap, extra blankets. The welcome binder on the kitchen table had the Wi-Fi password, the generator instructions in case the power went out, the number for the owner if something broke, and a handwritten note on the second page that said, "Please do not try to open the door at the end of the hall. It is a storage room and the lock is old." T read the binder the way people read welcome binders in rental properties, thoroughly enough to find the Wi-Fi password and skim the rest. She noted the instruction about the door, looked down the hallway, saw the door at the end of it, and returned to unpacking. The instructions seemed practical. Old locks in old cabins stuck, and an owner who had dealt with guests forcing a storage room door and damaging an old lock would reasonably leave a note about it. The hallway had 3 doors. She registered this without particularly focusing on it. The first door on the right was the main bedroom. The second door on the left was the workspace. The third door was at the far end of the hall, flush against the back wall of the cabin, shorter than the other 2 doors, slightly narrower, with a bolt on the outside that was old enough to have rusted in its housing, the reddish-brown of long-term oxidation. The bolt was thrown. The door was locked from the outside. She set up her laptop in the workspace, made coffee, ate the sandwich she had packed for the drive, and worked for 2 hours. The cabin was quiet in the way she had needed it to be. No traffic, no voices, no mechanical hum beyond the baseboard heat and the faint sound of the creek below the lot. She could hear wind in the trees above the cabin and occasionally a branch moving against the roof, light and irregular. She worked until 11 and went to bed. At 2 in the morning, she woke. The sound was from the direction of the third door. A soft creak, like wood under slow pressure, the sound of weight shifting against a door, something leaning and then adjusting. She was awake immediately in the complete way that certain sounds produce wakefulness. She lay still and listened. The sound did not repeat. She waited several minutes. Nothing. She told herself it was the building settling. Mountain temperatures in western North Carolina dropped fast after dark in the shoulder season, and wood frame structures responded to temperature change with exactly the kind of soft creak she had heard. Storage rooms had shelves. Shelves had things on them. Things shifted. She went back to sleep. The second night, the sound was different. She was deeper asleep when it happened the second night, which meant she came out of it more slowly and with less certainty about what had woken her. She lay still in the dark and waited for her mind to catch up with her body. The cabin was quiet. The creak was barely audible through the bedroom window, which she had cracked an inch for air. The baseboard heater ticked. Then she heard it again and understood immediately what it was, because it was a sound she had heard thousands of times in her life. The sound of a door handle being tried. A small, deliberate rotation of a knob, not hard, not urgent, exploratory. The sound of someone checking whether a door was locked. She sat up in the bed. Her room door had a knob with a push-button lock on the interior side, the kind found in rental properties throughout the country, adequate for privacy rather than security. She watched the knob in the dark. It did not move. The sound was not from her door. The hallway had 3 doors. She understood the architecture in the way you understand something when understanding it is no longer academic. The 3rd door at the end of the hall had a bolt on the outside. On her side of the door, the hallway side. That bolt was the only lock on that door, which meant the door could be locked from the hallway and unlocked from the hallway, but could only be opened from inside the room itself, by someone already inside it. She had locked it from the outside when she arrived, or she had believed it was locked, because the bolt was thrown when she looked at it. But she had not touched the bolt herself. She had assumed it was thrown when she arrived because it appeared thrown. She got up and crossed her room quietly and put a chair under her door handle with the back rail wedged under the knob. She did this without turning on any light. She went to the desk by the window and sat in the desk chair and watched the window and the door and listened to the hallway, and she did not hear the sound again. She also did not check the hallway. She sat in the chair until the window lightened with the first gray of morning, and then sat for another half hour after that. And then she made coffee and opened her laptop and worked, because sitting was worse than working, and working required enough of her attention to keep the night from settling into her too completely. She told herself, with the daylight and the coffee, and the ordinary sounds of a morning cabin, that the sound could have been the 3rd door's frame responding to temperature change in a way that mimicked a handle being tried. Old doors in old frames moved in cold air. The explanation was available. She used it because it was available, and because the alternative made the next 2 days alone in the cabin into something she was not sure she could manage. She spent the 3rd day working in the main room rather than the workspace. She propped the front door open to the cold morning air, more for the feeling of openness than the temperature, and worked at the kitchen table. In the afternoon, she walked the property perimeter. The lot was wooded, the timber coming close to the cabin on 3 sides, the 4th side opening to the creek below a short slope. She found the back door on that pass, a door from the kitchen to a small rear porch facing the creek, 4 steps down to a stone path that led to the creek bank. She had not noticed it on arrival because it was in a corner of the kitchen, partly behind the opening of the refrigerator door. She tried the handle. It opened. She stood in the back doorway and looked at the stone path in the creek and thought about the fact that the back door had been unlocked when she arrived. The welcome binder had not mentioned it. She drove to town the next morning for supplies, coffee, bread, the basics. The town was 20 minutes on the secondary road, a small mountain community with a hardware store, a grocery, a diner that was closed on weekdays. She went to the hardware store for a slide bolt she could install on the back door herself, which would take 10 minutes and a screwdriver. The man behind the counter was middle-aged, unhurried, the kind of person who worked a hardware store in a small mountain town and knew every piece of inventory in the building by location rather than by catalog number. She mentioned she was staying at the cabin on the upper road and needed a slide bolt for a back door. He asked which cabin. She described the location, the gravel road off the secondary road, the wooded lot above the creek. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone placing a specific thing. He said, "That one's had some trouble with people getting up on the property from the creek side. Folks from down the holler sometimes walk the creek." He paused. "Owner ought to keep that back door locked." He said it practically, without drama, the way he might have said the roof needed new flashing or the well pump was undersized. A practical assessment of a practical problem. T bought the slide bolt and drove back. She installed the bolt on the back door and then walked down the hallway to the third door and looked at the bolt on the outside of it. She was certain when she arrived it had been pressed flush against the wood, fully thrown, the bolt seated in its housing. It was now standing out from the wood by approximately a quarter inch on the latch side. Not open, not unthrown, but shifted. As if something had pressed against the door from the inside with enough sustained force to move the bolt slightly in its housing without quite clearing the latch. She stood in the hallway and looked at the bolt for a long time. Then she took out her phone and photographed it. She photographed the door, the frame, the bolt in its current position. She went to the kitchen and photographed the back door with the new slide bolt installed. She went back to the welcome binder and read it again, completely, including the back pages she had skimmed on arrival. On the back of the last page, in smaller handwriting than the main entries, there was a second note she had not seen before. It said, "If you hear anything from the end room, please do not engage. Previous guests have had issues with animals getting in from below. We have taken care of it." The note was dated 2 weeks before T's booking date. She read it twice. She photographed it. She stood in the kitchen with the binder open and thought about what getting in from below meant in the context of a cabin on a wooded lot above a creek, and what it meant in the context of a door that could only be opened from the inside, and what it meant in the context of the back door that had been unlocked when she arrived, and the boot print she found when she looked down at the kitchen floor between the back door and the hallway entrance, a single partial print facing the hallway in mud that had dried enough to be stiff at the edges. One print, no others. She had not been outside in muddy boots the previous day. She checked out one day early. She loaded her car and called the owner from the top of the gravel road where the signal was adequate. The owner answered and asked why she was leaving early. She described the boot print and the shifted bolt. The owner was quiet for a moment and said he would look into it and offered a partial refund. T said she did not want the refund. She did not explain why. She drove back to the city with the heat on and did not stop until she reached the highway. She posted the account and the photos to a regional Appalachian horror community she had found while looking into similar stories online. The bolt photo was clear enough that the shifted position was visible to anyone who looked at it with any care. The footprint photo was partial and could be interpreted as a scuff mark by anyone inclined to interpret it that way. The binder note was photographed clearly and read exactly as she described it. She posted all 3 images. Several people responded. One commenter, within hours, identified the cabin from the description of the gravel road and the lot above the creek. They said they had stayed there a year prior. They said they had heard the door handle sound on their second night. They said they had not gone back to the hallway to check and had not told the owner when they checked out because they had not been sure enough of what they heard to say it without sounding unstable. They said they had been sure enough. T checked out of the listing that week and found the hallway was still not shown in the listing photos. The third room was still described as storage. The cabin was still available to book. The owner called once more, 2 days after the checkout call, to ask if she had taken photos of the binder. She said she had. He said he would appreciate it if she did not share them publicly. She did not respond to that, and he did not call again. 3 months later, she received an email from a stranger who had found her post. A woman who said she had stayed in the same cabin and had left a note in the welcome binder, a handwritten note inserted in the back pages, warning future guests about the third door, describing exactly what she had experienced. She said she had done this deliberately, so the next person would know before the second night rather than after it. The note was not in the binder when T arrived. Someone had removed it before her stay. T checks every door of every rental property now. Front door, back door, interior doors, closet doors, the door at the end of any hallway. She reads welcome binders page by page. She installs the slide bolt on the back door before she unpacks her bag. She photographs the binder when she finds one. She has not stayed in a remote cabin rental since Ashe County, though she tells herself she will when the right trip comes up. The right trip has not come up. She does not think often about what was on the other side of the third door. She thinks more often about the note that was removed, about the fact that someone, between the previous guest's stay and her own, had gone into that binder and taken out the warning. She thinks about who would have done that, and why, and whether the answer to those questions is more frightening than what she heard in the hallway, or less. She has not decided. 2 witnesses are supposed to make a story more credible. In this case, it just means there are 2 people who cannot explain the same 43 miles. Marcus had been the one to suggest the fishing spot. He had heard about it from a co-worker who had a cousin in Harlan County, the kind of local knowledge that passes through several hands before reaching you and arrives slightly vague at the edges but specific enough on the central point. Good water, good fish, not heavily trafficked. The access road was the part the co-worker had been less clear about, which was why Marcus had driven to the Ranger District office the month before and gotten a printed Forest Service road map, the kind they kept behind the counter for people asking about fire roads and timber routes. The map showed the logging road as a through road. That was the essential fact. It connected 2 secondary roads across the ridge, and the distance between the entry gate and the exit onto the paved road was marked as 2.2 miles. Marcus had measured it twice with his thumbnail against the map's scale bar, because Deke, who was driving, was skeptical of unmarked roads and needed the reassurance of specificity. They had filled up in town on a Saturday morning in late September. Marcus had folded the map wrong getting it back into the glove box, and Deke had said something about it, and Marcus had said something back, and they had argued about the map for about 4 minutes in the way that 2 people who have known each other a long time argue, without heat, without resolution, both of them knowing the argument would be abandoned before the destination. Deke drove. Marcus navigated. The gate was rusted but standing open, which Marcus took as confirmation that the road was in regular enough use to not be gated shut. He got out and looked at the road surface. Gravel, rough, the center strip grown up with grass in a way that suggested infrequent vehicle traffic but not abandonment. Deke's truck could handle it. Marcus got back in and they went through. The first half-mile was straightforward. They passed an old skid deck on the right, a rusted metal frame where the logging equipment had once been staged, sitting in a cleared area that had grown back to brush around the edges, and 2 side spurs that departed from the main road to the left. both of them gated and marked with no entry signs. The road narrowed after the second spur but continued clearly ahead. The ridge was above them to the left, the slope dropping to the right into mature timber. The map showed the road cutting along the contour of the ridge for the full 2.2 miles before emerging on the secondary road. After what Marcus estimated was 2 miles, they had not emerged. Deke checked the odometer when Marcus mentioned it. 2.6 miles from the gate. The road ahead looked exactly as it had for the past 2 miles. Same gravel surface, same grass in the center strip, same ridge above to the left, same timber dropping to the right. No secondary road, no intersection, no gate, no change in the road's character that would suggest they were approaching an exit. Marcus opened the map and confirmed the road and confirmed the scale and confirmed the exit should have appeared by now. They drove another half mile, then another. The road continued. Deke said the map was probably wrong, which was a reasonable position. Forest Service maps of logging roads were notoriously unreliable. Roads got rerouted around washouts, and the maps did not get updated. Gates got installed where the map showed open road, exits got decommissioned. The map Marcus was holding was printed, not digital, and had no date on it that he could find. It was entirely possible that the road no longer connected where it appeared to connect, that the exit onto the secondary road had been gated or washed out or simply closed since the map was drawn. They agreed on this and drove on. A mile and a half later, they passed the skid deck. Marcus saw it first. The same rusted metal frame, the same cleared area grown back to brush, the same spatial relationship to the road. Right side, set back about 20 feet from the shoulder. He said nothing for a moment because he was doing what people do when they see something that should not be there, which is to look for the explanation that makes it possible without requiring you to accept the alternative. He looked for a second skid deck, a different one that happened to look the same. The rust pattern on the frame was identical. There was a downed limb on the right side of the cleared area, between the frame and the tree line, in exactly the same position it had been in when they passed the first time. He said, "That's the skid deck." Deke looked at it and said there could be 2 of them, which was the explanation Marcus had already tested and discarded, but he accepted it anyway because they were still moving and the road was still ahead of them, and the alternative required stopping to address something neither of them was ready to address. They drove on. Marcus found a pen in the center console and marked the skid deck's location on the map, drawing a small circle on the road at the approximate point. 40 minutes later, they passed it again. Deke stopped the truck. The engine idled. Neither of them spoke. Marcus looked at the odometer. 11.3 miles since the gate. The map showed 2.2 miles of road. The skid deck sat on the right side exactly as it had the first time and the second time. Marcus looked at the downed limb. Same position. He got out of the truck and walked to the skid deck and put his hand on the frame. The rust came off on his palm in the fine, dry way that old rust does. He looked at the road ahead and the road behind. Both looked identical. Same gravel, same grass strip, same canopy above, same ridge to the left. He got back in the truck. "Turn around," he said. Deke turned around. They drove back the way they had come, or the way that should have been the way they had come, for what felt like 10 minutes, long enough to cover at least a mile of road at their speed. The road curved to the left. They followed the curve. They were facing the skid deck again. They tried it twice more. Each time, the road behind them curved in a way that produced the forward road. Each time, they ended up facing the skid deck. On the 4th attempt, Deke reversed the truck in a straight line down a straight section of road for what he estimated was a quarter mile. watching the rearview mirror, steering by the road edges. They ended up facing the skid deck. It was now behind them. Marcus got out and took a water bottle from the cooler in the truck bed and placed it in the center of the road ahead of them, upright, in the middle of the grass strip. He got back in. Deke drove forward. They watched the water bottle in the mirror until it was out of sight around a curve. They drove. The road continued. The skid deck appeared on the right. The water bottle was standing upright in the grass strip on the road ahead of them, undisturbed, waiting. Marcus picked up the water bottle and held it, and neither of them said anything about what it meant that the bottle was in front of them when they had placed it behind them and driven away from it. There was not a useful thing to say. The odometer read 22 miles from the gate. The road was 2.2 miles long. The sun had moved in the sky above the canopy in the way that indicated hours had passed rather than the 40 minutes that Marcus's sense of time suggested. Deke drove. He did not try to turn around again. He did not try to reverse. He drove forward on the road, and he drove faster than was comfortable on the gravel surface, the truck pitching on the rough spots and the branches scraping the mirrors on the narrow sections. He drove like a man who had run out of other options, which was accurate. He drove for what felt like 15 minutes at that speed, which at that speed should have covered 2 miles of road regardless of what the odometer said about cumulative distance. He drove without speaking, and Marcus did not speak either, and both of them watched the road ahead. The gate appeared around a curve. Not gradually, not as a landmark they approached in the normal way of landmarks. It was simply there when the curve resolved. The rusted gate across the road closed, a chain through the frame and a padlock on the chain. Deke stopped the truck 10 feet from it. The gate was closed and padlocked. When they had driven in that morning, it had been standing open with no padlock in evidence. Someone had padlocked it while they were on the road. A man was standing beside the gate, to the left, near a county-marked pickup truck that was parked in the small pull-off area just outside the gate. He was looking at them without surprise, the way someone looks at something they have been waiting for. He was older, in a county work jacket, no particular expression. He did not react to their arrival with any of the surprise that their arrival should have produced in a person who had not been expecting two men to emerge from a gated road after however many hours they had been on it. He looked at them for a moment and said, "You boys been in there a while." He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask why they had been on the road, or where they were trying to go, or how they had gotten past the gate in the first place. He produced a key and unlocked the padlock and swung the gate open and stood to the side. Deke drove through. Marcus watched the man in the mirror as they pulled away. He was closing the gate behind them. He was not watching them leave. He appeared to be examining the padlock. Before they reached the secondary road, the man was no longer visible in the mirror. Marcus was watching for him. He was simply not there. Deke drove to the secondary road and turned onto it and drove for a mile before pulling into a gravel turnout and stopping. He turned the engine off. They sat. Marcus looked at the odometer and did the arithmetic. The total mileage on the road, from entry to exit, was 43 miles. The road on the map was 2.2 miles. The sun was in a position that indicated mid-afternoon. They had entered the road before 10 in the morning. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Deke said, "That road doesn't loop." He said it as a statement, not a question, and Marcus understood what he meant, that the physical road they had been on had no loop configuration, that the map showed it as a straight line, and the terrain was consistent with a straight line, that a road cannot loop if the terrain it runs through does not loop. What had happened on that road was not a loop. It was something else for which neither of them had a word. They stopped at the first gas station they found on the secondary road. Marcus called the county road department from the parking lot on his phone and asked about the gate on the logging road. He gave the location as specifically as he could. The woman he spoke to said the department maintained several gated roads in that part of the county, and could he be more specific? He described the gate and the rusted frame and the pull-off area. She put him on hold for a few minutes and came back and said that road was managed by the timber leaseholder, not the county, and gave him a number. He called the number. It rang for a long time and went to a voicemail for a company name he did not recognize. 2 weeks later, Marcus drove back to the gate in daylight, alone. The gate was closed and padlocked. Through the gate, he could see the road beginning, the gravel surface, the grass in the center strip. No water bottle was visible on the road from the gate, which was consistent with the bottle being around the first curve and out of sight, or consistent with the bottle not being there. He could not go in to check because the gate was locked. He called the county road department again with the gate's GPS coordinates from his phone. They confirmed no county employee had been at that location on the Saturday in question. They had no record of a county vehicle at that location. No county worker matching the description Marcus gave was identified when he described the man at the gate. Deke no longer uses paper maps. He will not take unmarked shortcuts. He has confirmed the account publicly once, in a single forum post, and has not discussed it since. Marcus keeps the account factual when he tells it. He does not use the word impossible because he considers it imprecise. He says the road behaved in a way that cannot be accounted for by map error, disorientation, driver fatigue, or mechanical error, and that the odometer reading is an objective record that does not require interpretation. He says the odometer does not lie. The water bottle is still on that road, if the road is the kind of road that holds what is left on it. He does not know what kind of road it is. He knows he has not gone back to find out, and that Deke has not suggested it, and that both of them moved out of Harlan County within 2 years of that Saturday, separately and for reasons that had nothing to do with the logging road, which is what they would tell you if you asked. The last account is the one I want you to sit with. Not because it is the loudest, because it is the most specific. Elton had been hunting alone for 30 years before that Wednesday in November, and in 30 years of hunting alone in the hollows and ridges of Wise County, Virginia, he had experienced nothing he could not account for. He had been caught in bad weather on ridges far from his truck. He had had a tree stand fail on him at 8 feet and walked out with a twisted knee. He had heard coyotes that sounded like children, and owls that sounded like women, and the wind in particular hollow configurations that produced sounds with no natural analog he could name. He had accounted for all of it. He was a retired schoolteacher, and he thought about things the way a person who has spent decades explaining things to other people thinks about them. Carefully, sequentially, with a preference for explanations that held together under pressure. Nothing in 30 years of hunting alone had required him to say he did not have an explanation. That Wednesday was the last day of the group's stay. Him, his brother, and 2 nephews who hunted the leased land in Wise County every November. The others had packed out Tuesday evening. Elton stayed an extra day, which was normal. He had done it most years. His wife Helen knew he was staying, knew his routine, knew he would call from the ridge where the signal was adequate when he was heading out. He had called her Tuesday evening and Tuesday morning, and they had spoken for about 10 minutes. The ordinary conversation of people who have been married long enough to compress a great deal into a short call. She was fine. The dog had gotten into something in the yard. His brother had called to confirm he'd gotten home safely. Drive carefully tomorrow. He climbed into the stand at 5:30 in the morning, in the dark, by feel and by the muscle memory of having climbed that particular stand more times than he had counted. It was an elevated platform stand, fixed to a white oak at about 14 feet, overlooking a natural bench in the hollow where deer crossed between their bedding area in the thick timber and a cornfield on the far side of the ridge. He had taken good deer from that stand. He knew the bench and the crossing and the angles the way you know a place you have returned to faithfully for years. The hollow below him was steep and wooded, the floor about 150 feet below his elevation, a creek running along the bottom that he could hear faintly on quiet mornings. The far side of the hollow was county forest land, no road access. No other hunters on the lease that day. The nearest farm was half a mile in any direction that mattered. He ate a cold biscuit from his pack around 9 o'clock, watched two does work the far tree line at distance, decided against either of them. Good morning. Quiet. The kind of morning that accumulated in a man over 30 years of hunting alone and became part of what he understood the world to be. Around 11 o'clock, he heard footsteps in the hollow below him. Leaf crunch. Slow and deliberate, the careful placing of weight that deer used when they were moving through timber they were uncertain about. He went still in the stand and watched the bench below. Nothing crossed it. He watched the slope between the bench and the hollow floor. Nothing visible. The footsteps continued along the hollow floor for about 30 seconds, moving from his left to his right at roughly the pace of a walking deer, and then stopped. He waited. The hollow was quiet. He told himself deer or turkey. Turkeys on dry leaves produced a sound indistinguishable from a person walking, and he had been fooled by turkeys before. Every hunter had. Could have been a coyote working the creek edge. The hollow amplified sound and threw it in ways that made distance and direction unreliable. He told himself these things and believed them and settled back into the stand. 20 minutes later, the footsteps returned. They came from the same direction, the same pace, the same deliberate placement of weight on dry leaves. And this time, they stopped directly below the stand. He could feel the difference in the sound, the way the acoustic space of the hollow changed when the source was directly below him rather than at distance along the floor. He sat forward and looked down through the canopy. The leaves were mostly down. The light was dappled and complex, broken by the remaining canopy and the ridge above, and the hollow floor directly below him was in shadow. He could not see clearly. He could see the shape of the floor, the creek catching light 40 yards away, the pale columns of the larger trees. He could not see what was standing under his stand. Then the voice spoke. It said Helen's name. Her full name, first name and last name, his last name, the name she had taken when they married 31 years ago. It said it in the tone of someone calling for a person they expected to find in the vicinity, the unhurried tone of a person who believed the person they were calling was nearby and would answer. It was not Elton's voice. It was not his brother's voice, not his nephew's voices, not any voice he had heard before. It was adult, clear, unhurried. It came from directly below him, from the shadow under the stand, from whatever was standing on the hollow floor in a place where no person should have been, and where, as far as Elton knew, no person was. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not look down again. He sat with his hands on the stand rail and the cold metal under his palms, and he listened to his own breathing and managed it the way you manage something that is trying to become something else. And he did not make a sound. He watched his watch. 11 minutes passed. The hollow was silent below him. No footsteps, no voice. The creek, the wind moving through the canopy above. His own breathing, managed. The biscuit wrapper in his jacket pocket that made a small sound when he moved, and so he did not move. He thought about what the voice had done. It had not called his name. It had not called a generic greeting. It had called Helen's full name, which was his wife's name, which was the name of a person who was at home half a mile away by air and several miles by road. His wife, whose name was not a secret and was not unusual, but whose presence in this hollow on this morning had no explanation that held together. No person who had business on this lease knew to call for Helen here. No person who might have wandered onto the lease from the county forest land would know his wife's name. Full name, said in that particular unhurried tone. He thought about what it would mean to look down. He decided not to look down. He understood this as a decision rather than a failure of nerve, which was a distinction that mattered to him then and matters to him now. He began to move, slowly. He released the climbing harness clip with the minimal motion required, easing the metal hardware with his thumb to prevent the click it would otherwise make. He got his feet under him on the stand platform. He went down the tree in the way he had learned to go down trees, facing the trunk, testing each step before committing weight, keeping his body close to the bark. 14 feet. He stepped off the last foot peg onto the hollow floor and stood at the base of the white oak and did not look toward the center of the hollow where the voice had come from. He walked, not toward the hollow floor and not toward the bench. He went up the slope toward the ridge line, which was the longer route back to his truck but kept him elevated and away from the hollow bottom. He moved through the timber at a pace that was as fast as the terrain allowed without being a run. And he did not run because running on that slope in hunting boots was a way to fall and fall badly, and because something in him understood that the pace mattered, that moving with deliberate speed was different from moving with panic, and that the difference might matter. He was halfway up the ridge when the voice came again, from below him, from the hollow floor. The same tone, the same full name, Helen's name, spoken with the same unhurried certainty. Slightly louder than before, not dramatically louder, the adjustment in volume of someone who believes the person they are calling has moved further away and is compensating. As if it had noticed he was no longer in the stand and was recalibrating. He did not stop walking, he did not turn around. He fixed his eyes on the ridgeline above him, and he walked, and he kept his breathing managed, and he did not look back at the hollow. The voice did not call a third time. The ridge came up under his boots and he crossed it, and the hollow dropped away behind him, and the timber on the west face opened up slightly, and he could see the sky above the canopy and the color of the afternoon in it. He reached his truck and sat in it for a while before starting the engine. He drove to the ridge where the signal was adequate and called Helen. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was exactly her voice, the voice he had heard for 31 years, the particular quality of it that no other voice had. He said he was heading out early, he would be home by dinner. She said that was fine, and then she said, "I tried to call you this morning. Both calls went to voicemail." He said that was normal, no signal in the hollow. She said, the second call was strange. Before the voicemail picked up, it sounded like someone answered, just for a second, and then stopped. She paused. I thought it was a bad connection. I almost didn't mention it. He asked what time the second call was. She said she would check. He heard her moving. She came back and said 11:04. He looked at his watch. The voice below his stand had spoken at approximately 11:17. 13 minutes after something had answered Helen's call on a phone that was in Elton's jacket pocket in a stand he was sitting in a hollow where no one else should have been. He drove home. Helen said he came in and sat at the kitchen table without unpacking his truck, which she noticed because he was a methodical man who unpacked before he did anything else after a trip. She made dinner, he ate. He did not tell her the full account that night, or for 3 weeks after. When he did tell her, sitting at the same kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in December, she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked to see her phone. He asked why. She said she wanted to look at the call log. The second missed call from that Tuesday morning was still in the history. The timestamp read 11:04. She showed him the screen. He looked at it for a while and handed the phone back. His rifle is still in the stand. He did not take it when he left the hollow, and he has not gone back for it. The lease changed hands the following year, taken over by a different hunting club whose contact Elton spoke to once, by phone, to mention what had happened in the hollow, the detail about the voice. The contact was quiet for a moment and then said they had heard some odd things in that hollow, but nobody had gotten specific about it. Nobody from the new club hunted the hollow floor. They used the benches and the ridge. It was not a formal arrangement. Nobody had proposed it formally. It had simply become what they did, without discussion. When Elton's nephew offered to go back for the rifle, Elton said no. He did not explain further, and the nephew did not press. The nephew had heard enough of the account to understand that the rifle being in that stand was, in some way he could not fully articulate, the correct outcome. Some things are better left where they fell. Some debts to a place are better not collected on. Elton still holds a hunting license. He renews it each year in the way that a person maintains a habit that has become more about identity than about the thing itself. He has not used it. When people ask whether he is going out this season, he says his knees are not what they were. Helen, when asked directly by people who know them both, says she thinks it is not his knees. She says this without elaboration, which is the correct way to say it. The worst part of the account, according to Elton, is not the voice itself. It is not the fact of it calling Helen's name, or the phone call, timestamp, or the rifle left in the stand. The worst part is the implication underneath all of those details, that whatever was in that hollow had done something before it spoke, that it had listened long enough, or watched closely enough, or knew in some way that Elton cannot explain which name to use. Not his name. Helen's name. The name that would bring him down from the stand. It had not guessed, it had known, which meant it had, in some sense, learned him. Learned what would work on him specifically, what would move him, before it ever spoke a word. He does not know when that learning happened. He does not know how long the hollow had been watching him before the Wednesday he stayed alone. He hunted that stand for years. He was in it every November. He sat at 14 feet above the hollow floor and watched the bench and listened to the creek and ate his cold biscuit and thought he was alone. He does not think about that too often. He has found that the mind, given a thought it cannot resolve, will return to it in the small hours with a persistence that serves no useful purpose. He has learned to set it aside before it gets hold of him. He is a practical man and a patient one, and he has made peace with not knowing, which is a thing that takes more courage than most people who haven't needed it would understand. He still drives past the ridge road on his way to his brother's place every few weeks. He does not slow down. He does not look at the pull-off where they used to park the trucks before walking into the hollow. He keeps his eyes on the road and his hands on the wheel, and he drives past it at the same speed every time. Helen says he has never once turned the radio on before that bend since the November he came home early. He does not remember deciding not to. It is simply what he does now. The way certain things become what you do after the reason for them has been set aside but not forgotten. A quiet, specific, personal rule. The kind that does not require explanation because the person who made it knows exactly what it is for.